Hey everyone, I'm going to teach you about the last dynasty that we're going to learn about this year of China called the Han Dynasty. Before this, we have learned about the Shang Dynasty, we learned about the Qin Dynasty, we learned about the Zhou Dynasty, and this is the final one. I'm going to teach you about ancient China's dynasties called the Han Dynasty. So let's start with the basics, the how, the when, and the where. So first, this dynasty starts because it takes over the Qin Dynasty. That's kind of how these dynasties have been working, is they overthrow the one before it. So remember with the Qin Dynasty, with the Emperor Qin being a crazy ruler, a crazy emperor, a lot of people didn't really like the way he was leading. So they kind of start rebelling against him. And then the Han people eventually take over once Emperor Qin dies, and they establish the Han Dynasty. This takes place starting around 206 BCE, and it ends around 220 CE. So if you think about a timeline, and then you know that the birth of Christ is that red mark that I just put on there, 206 BCE is going to be on that left side of the timeline, and then 220 CE is going to be past the birth of Christ on the other side of the timeline. So even though it looks like those 2 years are pretty close together, they're really about 400 years apart. So this dynasty lasts about 400 years. They call it the Golden Age of China, which we're going to talk about in a second. We've heard that word before. And it kind of gets established in a large chunk of where present day China is today. So if you're looking at a map here of where the Han Dynasty takes place, we see up here that it's still located in Asia, in the part of ancient China here. But then this entire yellow region right here is going to be the Han Dynasty or the Han Emperor or Empire. So that is a large chunk of land that is covering most of present day China today. So this by far is the biggest dynasty out of the four that we have talked about. Present day China is in the green, Han Dynasty is in the yellow right there. So you see both rivers are still inside of there. We still see the access to the seas. And then we see the Great Wall of China that was started in the Qin Dynasty and then added on to in the Han Dynasty. So when we talk about golden ages, remember that we say golden ages are a time where there's a lot of different wealth and accomplishments. There's inventions happening, they have lots of money, and things are actually rolling pretty smoothly. And when stability just means things are okay, there's not a lot of war going on, everybody's kind of improving and just kind of working together and accomplishing a lot of things during this time. So the seven main categories of things that they're going to improve upon are warfare, government, agriculture, industry, art, medicine, and science. So these are the seven categories that they're going to make some improvements or adjustments to within the Golden Age of China called the Han Dynasty. So let's start with warfare. So the first thing to know about warfare is they had a very large and super well organized army. That's because a lot of times men were required to be in the army at this time. So a lot of times, if you're between the ages of 25 and 60 and you're a male, you were pretty much guaranteed that you had to serve some type of time in the military during this time. Sometimes it was like a 2 year commitment. Sometimes people served longer, but you were required to serve. So there was about 120,000 to 300,000 men throughout the Han Dynasty that would be serving in the army. They improved a lot with iron during the Han Dynasty, which means that their weapons were also stronger. They were one of the first people to create weapons out of iron, especially swords that are going to be a lot stronger and tougher to battle with. Tougher on the opponent, but good for the people that have it in their hands, right? And then another invention that they have is the invention of crossbows, which you're going to see a picture of in a second. So crossbows look like this. They kind of have that cross mentality, and you would take some type of bow or some type of weapon, and you'd be able to shoot it across with the crossbow. They also actually used kites in the Han Dynasty for their warfare. Sometimes they would use them to send messages from one army to another, and sometimes they would use them actually just to kind of scare the enemy. So they would have them fly above an enemy territory, have something attached to it so it would jingle to kind of scare them in the middle of the night. So that's kind of an interesting fact. The second category of accomplishments here is going to be related to the government. So they still had a powerful government like the Qin dynasty, except they're going to be a little bit less harsh than Emperor Qin was. They're going to switch more to a Confucianism style of government, which means strong leaders, but they're going to be leading more by example. So within the government, there's a lot of different government officials of different levels, and pretty much everybody in the government was going to be controlling the people below them. So it's kind of like a hierarchy or social structure of which part you are in the government. If you were a higher level government official, that means you're going to be living closer to the capital. You're going to be advising the emperor and different things that he might need. And if you're a lower level government official, you might be controlling roads or canals or other things throughout the town. So you might be a little bit more spaced out. Kind of something cool about how they chose their government officials. A lot of it was actually based on knowledge and ability. So you would have to pass these like really long exams to prove that you were worthy enough to be a government official. So that actually required some knowledge rather than just, okay, you're part of this family. Okay, now you can work in the government. So it was less about social structure, more about knowledge and actual ability in the Han Dynasty. And then we've got agriculture, which is our third step here. Agriculture is just a fancy word for farming, so don't get super confused by that word. So the lives of farmers were pretty difficult. Not only were you required to grow crops for your villages and the place where you live, but you also had to have crops and food for your own family. Not to mention you had to have make your own clothing. You had to make your own homes. So you didn't have a lot given to you. You were also required a lot of times to have unpaid labor for other projects that the emperor wanted from you. So we can see that the farmers had a pretty low class, not caste. That was India. Some inventions that they had, though, that helped with farming. They invented the chain pump during the Han Dynasty, which looks kind of like this, where you would take these pedals and you would be able to move the water from the low irrigation ditches onto the fields. They also were improving a little bit in ironwork, like we said before, so they could use that iron and they could melt different iron into molds, which would kind of help create stronger plows that were able to sift through the ground a little bit more aggressively. They also were kind of the first people to use the wheelbarrow. So they'd take a large wheel at the front, and that made it easier to take items and things, crops and things from place to place. When we think of industry, which is our fourth accomplishment here, there's two major accomplishments that they're going to create in industry. Industry is kind of like a fancy word for things that they're making quickly and a lot of that are going to help their economy or their money. So the first thing you're going to see here is silk. And you might notice that there's a little animal up here. This is called a silkworm. That's actually how they made silk, was out of the cocoons of silkworms. And I'll show you a picture of a silkworm in a second. It was very difficult and it was very time consuming. And China at the time is the only one that knows how to make silk. So all the other countries that China might be trading with really want silk. So silk's super valuable and it's very highly wanted from all the places around China. Another industry that is really thriving during the time is salt. So they kind of learn in China how to take salt not only from the water, but also how to dig and mine into the ground to get salt out that way as well. So they're getting from the sea and the ground. So they're able to produce that, and that's a valuable item for preserving a lot of different things like meats and vegetables, and in past civilizations that we talked about, preserving even bodies, like in Egypt with mummification. So this is a silkworm, pretty interesting. So these silkworms would have a cocoon like this, and you can kind of see the fibers here on the side, and you would pull the fibers and you would have a certain process with it, and that's kind of how silk was made. So not super easy. A lot of the silk you might picture in your mind is actually fake silk, but this is kind of how they would make actual silk. The fifth accomplishment of the golden age of India, the Han Dynasty, is in art. The biggest accomplishment for sure is paper. Paper is a huge invention. We obviously use paper still all the time today. The very first form of paper is going to happen in China. In Egypt, they start with papyrus. They make papyrus, but in China, they're going to make more of an actual form of paper. Before paper, the Chinese people used to write on silk and bamboo. Silk was super expensive, right? So you didn't want to write on that very much. And then bamboo was very difficult to write on because they would just take a bunch of bamboo sticks, kind of twine them together, and then try to write on it, which is not a very good surface to write on. So paper was much easier, much cheaper to make, and it was a lot easier to kind of bind together into books and things once they figure out how to make it. And when they're making paper, they're taking bamboo and silk and other materials, and they're kind of making it in this like soup type thing, and then they're able to kind of dry it out and make paper that way. So a fancy style of writing that the Chinese create, and you might have seen it before, is a style called calligraphy, which is going to be a very soft brush stroke. You're going to use brush and ink, and then it kind of mixes between delicate and bold lines. So sometimes the letters are very thin, sometimes parts of the letters are very bold and thick. So calligraphy is kind of a cool style of writing. I would encourage you to look up some calligraphy online, and you can kind of see what I'm talking about there. The sixth accomplishment is going to be in medicine. So two major processes that they start in to kind of increase medicine during the Han Dynasty is first one's acupuncture, which you might have heard of, you might not have heard of. But you can kind of see up here, there's some needles. Because what they're trying to do here is that they're taking thin needles and they're placing them at certain parts of the body to try to balance out the forces of yin and yang, which you can kind of see that symbol up here, right? So they believe that you got sick if your yin and yang were out of balance. So they thought that with acupuncture, it kind of balances things out again. So these were like quick cures. So if you had a headache, they might place little needles near your head so that the pain of the needles would kind of balance out the pain of the headache, which then would hopefully cure you. For bigger illnesses, they would actually use something called moxibustion, which is where they would take small leaves and things like that, and they'd put them into a cone and they place them near the skin, and they would actually burn them. So they thought with the heat, it would reduce the pain, and then long-term illnesses might be cured that way. And then the last accomplishment of the dynasty, that's supposed to say number 7 up there, is in science. So there's 2 major inventions that they had to help science. The first one being the seismograph, which you can see in the picture right here. A seismograph is used to detect and measure earthquakes. We still use these today, except seismograph back then would be a lot more manual, not electric like we would have today. So what they would do is they would take these the seismograph, there's like these little balls in it, and then when the earthquake would hit, the ball would fall into one of these slots, which kind of shows which direction the earthquake was coming from. And then the second invention is the magnetic compass. So we know what compasses do, they tell directions. So one of the very first types of compasses would have also happened in the Han Dynasty with the magnetic compass, where they would have the spoon and then it would be able to determine direction. So as a recap, there is the 7 accomplishments of the Golden Age of China, which is the Han Dynasty, and hopefully you learned quite a few new things today.